Kia ora tātou, everybody, and thank you so much for coming along today. I have done some talks on Zoom, but I have to say I don't really enjoy them as much as I do talking to a live audience where you can get questions and get some response from people. So my association with Raymond McIntyre, as Janet said, stretches back over a quarter of a century to 1996, when Dame Claudia Orange, who was in charge of the Dictionary of New Zealand Biography project, discovered that I had completed my MA in art history at the University of Canterbury. I was working as the head of design history at Unitec at the time and curating exhibitions for the Hawke's Bay Museum in my old hometown of Napier, most summers to coincide with the Art Deco weekend. And Claudia commissioned me to write the biographies of a number of visual artists with Christchurch connections. But researching Raymond McIntyre's biography was the one that I enjoyed the most, as much as because I was able to read his letters that he'd sent home to his parents that were kept in 4 boxes at the Auckland Art Gallery. And I had also earlier seen the touring exhibition of 70 paintings, and some of you might have seen that as well. Anybody here remember that from 1984? It came to the National, what was then the National Art Gallery. And it went on display in the Robert McDougall Art Gallery when I was a university student in the 1980s and in my first year of MA study. So having seen those paintings and having read the letters, I felt that I could arrive at a tentative understanding of some of the concerns that preoccupied Raymond McIntyre over his exhibiting career, which seems to have come to an end in around about 1924, about a decade before he died. I also felt quite a lot of empathy for Raymond McIntyre, who, like me, suffers from a progressively deteriorating curvature of the spine, or scoliosis, which you can pick up in early photographs of him. This is the touring exhibition I just talked about from 1984, and I think you can see something of his slightly hunched over posture in this early photo. That hunching posture is also a feature of fellow artist Leonard Booth's caricature of Raymond McIntyre that was published in the exhibition Sketcher, a magazine that was published weekly while the New Zealand International Exhibition of 1906-07 was on display in Hagley Park in Christchurch. Like me, Raymond McIntyre chose not to have his scoliosis treated, though his reasons were religious, unlike mine. Though they were Anglicans originally, his entire family of 7 brothers and sisters, along with his Canadian father and Australian mother, had chosen to become the followers of Mary Baker Eddy and joined the Church of Christ Scientist. That church doesn't require that Christian Scientists avoid medical care. Adherents used dentists and optometrists and obstetricians and physicians for broken bones, and even vaccination when it's required by law. But it does maintain that prayer is the most effective when it is not combined with medicine. And in 1933, it was his Christian Science beliefs that led Raymond McIntyre to refuse treatment for a comparatively and completely treatable condition, a strangulated hernia which had become infected. And it was this that very quickly but painfully caused his death at the comparatively young age of 54. But that's enough grisly biography. Today I want to take you on a journey through McIntyre's work, beginning with a brief consideration of his New Zealand portraits. On the screen, we've got the portrait of the cellist, Gladstone Bell. Raymond McIntyre was also a superb and accomplished cellist. And this portrait was exhibited at the Canterbury Society of Arts in 1908. It was a commissioned work, and you'll notice how McIntyre builds his depiction of the musician by means of very carefully modulated tones, using very thin layers of paint. In terms of official New Zealand portraiture of the period, it's a completely and extremely competent and revealing work. You can see the subject seated there on the right-hand side, this gentleman here, in the photograph from the New South Wales State Conservatoire. Woman with a fur muff is probably not a commissioned portrait, but it does provide an excellent example of how McIntyre, in this period, exploits the possibilities of tonal gradation and dramatic lighting. Here the technique is almost flat, very thin washes of oil paint applied in a fashion reminiscent of a watercolour. As in the Gladstone Bell portrait I just showed you, the coarse texture of the canvas is readily apparent. Constance McIntyre, a portrayal of the artist's sister, is a monotype. That is, a unique print made from oil painted on glass and then printed on paper. McIntyre's willingness to experiment with various mediums remained with him throughout his career as the range of oils, watercolours, drawings, etchings and lino cuts and woodcuts that I'll show you demonstrate amply this kind of experimental attention to different techniques. McIntyre's strongest influence in Christchurch was probably his teacher at the Canterbury College School of Art. I think an artist that's probably going to be familiar to all of you, the Dutch artist Petrus van der Velden. But I would like to show examples of portraits by two New Zealand women painters of the period who achieve a comparable intimacy with their sitters. Grace Joel's Girl with a Scarf, for me, is an indisputable masterpiece. While McIntyre himself at this time wasn't as painting as well as Grace Joel was doing in New Zealand, it is easy for us to understand the kind of respect and regard that he had for Joel's work. And it's also clear in the account of meeting her in London, which he wrote in a letter back to his family in Christchurch. On the left, Mina Arndt's The Girl in the Blue Blouse is an informal portrait comparable to McIntyre's more experimental works of the same period. Girl in a White Dress on the right and Contempt, both painted in 1908, are amongst the most daring of McIntyre's Christchurch figure studies. There's no record of them ever having been exhibited, but these are intimate studies which are important in the way that they foreshadow his later preoccupation with essentially quite an informal style and type of portraiture. In Contempt, the work on the left, the use of the palette knife to apply paint and the summary modelling of the face, along with the low viewpoint and the confusion between figure and ground, all help to give an intensity to McIntyre's characterisation of his very high-spirited niece, Daphne McIntyre. Girl in a White Dress on the right, by contrast, is a study in introspection, yet painted from the same sitter. I want now to turn to McIntyre's New Zealand landscapes. In Christchurch, McIntyre's landscapes provided real problems for the reviewers. Here are two examples of what they wrote. One critic said, "Most of McIntyre's other pictures all bear too much of the impress of his impressionistic style, and we do not like them." And another declaimed in The Spectator, "McIntyre belongs to the Impressionist school, and that may account for our inability to praise any pictures by him. They are absolutely unlike anything in nature we have seen." I am very fond of these two works because I lived for quite a period of time in Dunedin. On the left, a beautiful view up George Street, which you can see towards the Octagon with the tram running along. And some of you might recognise the Dunedin railway station, the beautiful troop building and silhouettes there on the right. So you can understand something of the ideas that McIntyre was conveying that these critics found so upsetting. Impressionist and impressionistic, of course, do not refer to the now famous French school, but rather were pejorative terms that critics frequently used in the newspapers to criticise what they saw as a wayward technique, or simply any kind of adventurous use of colour that was not naturalistic. And of course, what is interesting in these small paintings is the freedom with which they are painted. When we look at the size of them, you can see there, they're not particularly big. And with these two examples, the one on the left possibly a view in Hagley Park in Christchurch, and on the right, an evening view from 1905. These are small paintings which would possibly been executed out of doors. I feel fairly confident, because of their size, that they would have been done in fresh air, or en plein air, as the French Impressionists described painting out of doors. Holidays for the rather large McIntyre family, his father was the mayor of New Brighton, involved travelling up to the hot springs at Hamner. And the experimental landscape that we see on the right might in fact have been painted around there or somewhere in the Lewis Pass. For a brief look at contemporaries of McIntyre who are also painting landscape at this time, I want to show you for consideration this work by Alfred Wilson Walsh. Walsh was a teacher of McIntyre's at the Canterbury College School of Art, and Walsh made a practice of direct watercolour sketching out of doors. Walsh's watercolour, it's called In the Bush from 1901, we can see small touches of paint by which he achieves his very convincing sense of space. This landscape oil, which is on the left here, by Petrus van der Velden, shows how close an affinity McIntyre had with the Dutch painter. Van der Velden was probably the mentor who prompted McIntyre to experiment with twilight effects, using the skyline and silhouettes of trees to maximum decorative advantage. I want to leap forward now several years to London, where Raymond McIntyre arrived in February of 1909. Unfortunately, no very early landscapes by him appear to have survived, possibly because his rather overzealous housekeeper burned and threw out quite a lot of the material that was left in the studio once he had died. So because we don't have those early landscapes, seeing these works comes as something of a shock. He was also somebody who was ruthless at censoring his own work. Anything he wasn't happy with, right throughout his life, he would either paint over or destroy. But these landscape panels, which date from around 1912, 1913, 4 years after he'd arrived in London, are, in my thinking, some of the most beautiful of his works. But they are very strongly reminiscent of Whistler's landscape paintings of the 1870s. Painted in August of 1871, this is the first of Whistler's nocturnes. In these works, Whistler aimed to convey a sense of the beauty and the tranquility of the Thames at night. It was the client Frederick Leyland who first used the term nocturne to describe Whistler's moonlight scenes. It aptly suggests the notion of a night scene, but with musical associations. And the expression was quickly adopted by Whistler, who later explained, and I quote, "By using the word nocturne, I wish to indicate an artistic interest alone, divesting the picture of any outside anecdotal things which might have been otherwise attached to it. A nocturne is an arrangement of line, form, and colour first." And from this, of course, was derived the theory of aestheticism, which I'll mention a little bit later. So what occasioned the painting of these works for Whistler? He was returning from a trip by steamer to Westminster, and he was inspired by a view of the river he described in a glow of rare transparency in the hour before sunset. Anna Whistler describes this, who was the artist's mother, in a letter to Julia and Kate Palmer. He immediately rushed to his studio and painted a sunset and the moonlit scene that we see here in one sitting. The picture's painted on panel, which is also a material that McIntyre adopted, primed with grey paint, over which Whistler applied very thin layers of pigment in order to create a contrasting sense of luminosity. The view is from Battersea looking across to Chelsea, and it's possible to make out features on the horizon, like the Chelsea Old Church that we can see here on the right. In the foreground, we can see a low barge and also the figure of a fisherman, indicated with the absolute minimum of detail, and the influence of Japanese art is evident both in the restricted palette, the economy of line, and also the characteristic butterfly signature. Can you see it there down at the bottom? Now, this picture was exhibited along with variations in violet at green at the Dudley Gallery in November 1871, and the critic for the Times, in a rare appreciation of Whistler's nocturnes, described them as illustrations of the theory of aestheticism, that painting is so closely akin to music that the colours of the one may and should be used like the ordered sounds of the other. That painting should not aim at expressing dramatic emotions, depicting incidents of history, or recording facts of nature, but should be content with moulding our moods and stirring our imaginations by subtle combinations of colour, through which all that painting has to say to us can be said, and beyond which painting has no valuable or true speech whatsoever. Now, Whistler lived in the very street in Chelsea, Chain Walk, from which McIntyre had painted his view of the Thames. Many comments in McIntyre's letters and later correspondence and writing indicate that he regarded Whistler as a hero and a mentor. He loved Whistler's single-minded commitment to a highly personalised and refined style of aestheticism, providing a path for McIntyre to follow. Here is Whistler's nocturne in blue and gold, Old Battersea Bridge, which shows the old bridge across the River Thames before it was replaced by the modern one. Chelsea Old Church, again, we can see in the background here, and on the north bank of the river, and the recently built Albert Bridge over here, with fireworks going off above. The picture is an evening view full of atmospheric effect, but what Whistler has done with it is exaggerate some of the features, particularly making the bridge taller than it actually was for added effect. Hokusai, the Japanese artist, who was a favourite of Whistler's, produced a similar picture of a tall wooden bridge with fireworks. This, of course, is one of a series of nocturne paintings which achieved great notoriety in Britain in the later 1870s, when influential critic John Ruskin visited an exhibition of the series at the Grosvenor Gallery. He wrote of the exhibition that Whistler was asking 200 guineas for flinging a pot of paint in the public's face. Whistler sued Ruskin for libel, the case reaching the courts at the end of the in 1878. The judge in the case, I love this, Baron Huddleston, caused tremendous laughter in the court when he completely sincerely asked Whistler, which part of the picture is the bridge? The case ended with Whistler getting awarded token damages of 1 farthing. But in 1905, Nocturne Blue and Gold became the first significant acquisition by the newly formed National Art Collections Fund. And it was this work that went on display in the Tate Gallery, where McIntyre would have had the opportunity to study it closely. Although McIntyre avoided the nocturnal pyrotechnics, he followed Whistler's example by adopting a monogram. You can see it in many of the paintings in this exhibition. You can also see it down here on these two paintings on the screen. He also followed Whistler in making use of flat, unmodulated expanses of colour with a very fluid application of essential details, the curve of a street or the form of a tree. Look at the wonderful drawing of the tree about to come into leaf that we can see on the right-hand side in the Thames. Also, the barely indicated barges, half seen through London's dense, foggy atmosphere. Although he was surviving on money orders sent by various members of his supportive family in Christchurch, in the summer of 1912, McIntyre was able to take a brief holiday in Normandy. The return fare from London to St Malo, he told his family, was 25 shillings, even less than the fare would have been up to Edinburgh. At St Malo, he encountered a port full of warships and quarrelling soldiers, sinister elements of the war to come, which played no part in the elegant landscapes that he developed from the sketches that he made while on holiday. And of course, the beautiful little work on the right here, La Somme, which was in Avenel McKinnon's collection, is on the wall just over there. So if we look at this, these particular views and consider the size of them, it's almost entirely likely that he would have painted these out of doors. They would have been painted from sketches that he then worked up. I'd like to now consider McIntyre's most renowned paintings, the panels of women's heads. I think their antecedents can be found in Whistler as well, particularly in Whistler's portraits, in which the sitter is invariably made subordinate to what is a very complex decorative scheme. And he was also, I think, a little influenced by the Pre-Raphaelite painter Dante Gabriel Rossetti, whose, quote, immense sincerity McIntyre admired on a visit to the Tate Gallery in 1911. On the right here, Whistler's work shows a woman in full figure standing on a wolf skin in front of a white curtain with a white lily in her hand. The colour scheme of the painting is almost entirely white. The model is Joanna Heffernan, the artist's mistress. And though the painting was originally called The White Girl, Whistler later started calling it Symphony in White, No. 1. By referring to the painting in such abstract terms, he intended to emphasise his art for art's sake philosophy of aestheticism. Whistler created this painting in the winter of 1861 to 62, and though he later returned to it and made alterations, he sent it off to the Royal Academy and to the Salon in Paris, both of which rejected it. It was eventually accepted for the Salon de Refusé in 1863. And this was the exhibition that also featured Edward Manet's famous Déjeuner sur l'herbe, and together those two works gained a lot of attention. Alongside the white girl on the screen is Raymond McIntyre's Le Désir, one of the earliest London works of McIntyre's to have survived, and the first exhibition success that he had in London. On its acceptance for exhibition at the New English Art Club, he wrote to his family excitedly, and I quote, "It's like getting the blue ribbon already just to get in at the New English." The NEAC was an exhibiting group of advanced artists that had formed in opposition to the stodgy Royal Academy. When we look at Le Désir here on the screen, we can see that it's been executed with plentiful paint, giving a degree of texture that wouldn't re-emerge in his work until the later 1920s. The paint handling is in line with the current practice of Walter Sickert, an artist who gave McIntyre some lessons when he got to London, but in conception, I think it is closer to the contemporary work of Wilson Steer, an artist who McIntyre admired intensely. He had some questions about Walter Sickett's morality, which put him off that artist. So it's an unusual subject, Le Désir. It is alternatively titled The Girl Behind the Curtain, and that perhaps cues us in to the fact that it might be a scene of eavesdropping or voyeurism, but it's an exceptionally strong picture, indicating how far McIntyre had moved with the development of his style since Christchurch days. The series of paintings that McIntyre produces and that follow on from this work are variations on depictions of the 22-year-old actress Phyllis Cavendish, who he met in 1912. For me, they're amongst his most appealing works, and they provoked critical acclaim for him when they were exhibited at the Goupil Gallery Salon in 1913. McIntyre met the 22-year-old Phyllis when she agreed to become the subject for his work, and he created over a dozen portraits in oil and watercolour. Writing home to his father on the 6th of December in 1912, McIntyre states, "I did the best work I have ever done so far, just using her. I like to go outside the run of professional models, of which there are hundreds and hundreds in London, and get people of a more normal type and who do not live in the atmosphere of studios all the time. It is more interesting to have a breath of the outside world come along with different interests and information to impart. These stage folk who I have had are very helpful to me in this way." From Bassano's photographic portraits of Phyllis Cavendish in the National Portrait Gallery in London, it's clear that her head structure, the bone structure, the long neck, the full lips, the dark eyebrows, the wavy hair, the small defined nose are all conveyed in Raymond McIntyre's portraits. No wonder these paintings were such a huge success at the Goupil Gallery. Goupil's was one of the leading avant-garde private galleries, and it's such a coup that Raymond McIntyre was asked to exhibit there. They were the gallery that had also shown Monet in 1889, Toulouse-Lautrec in 1898, and their annual salons included a huge range of modern French work, as well as leading British artists. I'll quote from a 1913 review which compares Raymond McIntyre's work to that of Augustus John. This is the quote: "Some of the same influences which have fashioned Mr. John's work are also to be found in 4 remarkable paintings by a new artist, which hang in the first gallery on the first floor. Mr. Raymond McIntyre's Phyllis has the general flatness of tone and abruptness of transition, together with the same vigour and freshness of paint and fine draftsmanship of Augustus John's best work, as well as a certain grace and charm of manner of which the unquiet and unstable Mr. John is quite incapable. Mr. McIntyre's girl in a black hat is also agreeable and fresh, and his 2 landscapes, Street and Saint-Valery-sur-Somme, and Estuary of the Somme, though small, are delightful in every way. The depictions of Phyllis Cavendish render her ethereal and heavy-lidded. You will notice that he gives them names like Felice, Lisette, Ruth, Suzette. They are not real women, or rather, they are not intended as portraits. Instead, they are ciphers, symbols of an ideal beauty. When an artist visiting his studio exclaimed, "What a glorious woman you are painting," McIntyre was most amused. This is how he explained the heads to his family in a letter home. "Really, I have invented her type. Though all the things I do like about her are there, yet it is the particular points that interest me that I accentuate and bring out, and I leave out the parts of her that don't help. One visitor, Mayo, particularly liked and said, "What lovely hair the woman had." Now, in this particular picture, I had painted her hair pitch black, and she hasn't got black hair at all. Whatever the scheme is that I have in mind, I vary the hair to suit it. So these heads represent a pictorial refinement that was comparable to the landscapes that are contemporary with them that I've just discussed. Despite the apparent flatness and the abrupt transition noted by the 1913 reviewer, McIntyre in a letter talked to his family about subtle, almost invisible gradations that he was proud of. For of course, every brushstroke was carefully considered with the effects of the finality and spontaneity as crucial ends. The later watercolour, following these oil paintings, Suzette here, which is called Woman in a Broad-Brimmed Hat, makes a very similar statement to the oils. It's a reduction to absolute essentials, and yet, as with the representations of Phyllis Cavendish, there's still a concrete sense of personality. In this case, the sitter was another actress, the Christchurch-born Eve Balfour, whose lost portrait in oils by Raymond McIntyre was reproduced in black and white by the magazine Colour, ironically, in 1918. In photographs of Eve Balfour, we confront a modern woman who gazes frankly at us, and you get the feeling that she and McIntyre must have moved in the same social circles in London. Let's turn now to look at McIntyre's development of landscape subjects. Whilst the earlier London panels that I've shown you used muted colouring, in the oils and watercolours of the succeeding years, McIntyre moved towards clearer, higher colour. This came as much from his immediate knowledge of British painting as it did from Gauguin, Matisse, and the other post-impressionists whose work was then being exposed to the British public. Roger Fry was an ardent propagandist for the post-impressionist cause, and his own painting is a kind of reflection of that involvement. On the right is one of Fry's many rural subjects at Charleston, which, like McIntyre's work of the same period, shows a fresh awareness of the possibilities of colour. Charles Ginner's Victoria Embankment Gardens provides another example of the high-keyed colour preferred by British post-impressionists in this period, this time in the context of an urban view. The Houses of Parliament rise in the background, and it's composed from the unusual viewpoint of the Victoria Embankment Gardens at quite a sort of raised level. The full foliage of summer obscures the buildings. You can see Big Ben and Victoria Tower with the flag at its pinnacle and the dome of Scotland Yard even, the turrets of the Palace of Westminster. Dwarfed in the foreground is a woman in a yellow hat, sitting on a park bench. Ginner's expressive handling of thick paint with heavy outlines may have been influenced by his appreciation of Van Gogh, but you can see these same black outlines in Raymond McIntyre's A Conference of 1918, which shows McIntyre delighting in the use of areas of intense colour, enclosed by a strong but elastic black line. McIntyre's London street scenes are a very interesting and varied group within his landscape production. The watercolour on the left, London Street with Jones' sign, nobody knows what the title is, but that's a description. Unlike the densely filled in A Conference that we just looked at, leaves the ground of speckled Japanese paper to play a major part in the unfinished picture, as the cobbled street does in the image on the right. The tilted picture plane, probably painted from a view in an upstairs window, the calligraphic penwork and the characteristic monogram in these works all contribute to the oriental flavour that was noted by a 1919 reviewer of these works. Frank Rutter, the influential critic and author, wrote a year earlier that McIntyre's watercolours are as personal as they are delightful. His figures, however slightly sketched in, they're full of life and movement, while they are placed to form an arresting pattern, and they are heightened by touches of pure colour to a genuine decorative value. McIntyre loved making works on paper, and he was again experimenting with printmaking in London. He made lithographs, etchings, linocuts and woodcuts. The views of London streets that he painted in oil are also comparable to the watercolours in their partial covering of the carefully primed panel or canvas surface and his sparing use of direct colour. These two London street scenes show his brushwork at its freest and most schematic. With several decisive strokes, he indicates the new type of motorbus that now hurtles through the streets of Chelsea, or with soft, virtually translucent strokes of blue paint on the left, he notes down the shadows of a warm midsummer afternoon. From a back window in Queensberry Place, 1923, is a high view from another window, but by now we are nearing the end of his exhibiting career. McIntosh's brushwork is becoming heavier. There's an impasto completely covering the surface of the panel. His palette has moved down from that high-key colour to a sombre colour characteristic of his later work. What motivated McIntyre to record these London street scenes in this way? I think it was because London was changing rapidly during his life there, and his consciousness of the psychological effects of such change is evident in the following passage from a letter home to his father, dated 1912. He writes, "I was just thinking latterly how the character of London is changing, even the comparatively short time I have been here. Numerous changes and alterations have taken place. Streets have been widened, corners are done away with, names of streets combined and changed. Just think what it must be to anyone else whose memory of London dates back 25 years or so. And when he revisits it must seem like glimpses of the moon, for he has the company only of the remembrance of certain localities. I suppose this is the reason why all those old colonists in New Zealand mostly return back to their colonial homes or their other adopted countries." There may be a temptation to regard works like these street scenes as aberrations in McIntyre's art as a whole, but they're not. To my mind, it's the variety of approaches to landscape that are so interesting. Park entrance here, a watercolour done on a large scale, possesses a doofy-like brightness that reminds the viewer of autumn sunshine. Consider how, at roughly the same time as he executed this outdoor watercolour, he was able to paint in oils the cramped confines of his bedroom using the same intensity of colour. McIntyre frequently recorded his admiration for Matisse, and it's in his still lives and his interior views, I think, that influence is most apparent. On one occasion, McIntyre quoted from Matisse a passage that is equally pertinent to McIntyre's own practice. He said, "A picture is like a game of cards. You must figure out from the very beginning what you're going to have at the end. Everything must be worked backwards and always be finished before it's begun." McIntyre's brilliant self-portrait we see here on the wall from 1915, and also the contemporary depiction of his friend and fellow artist, the graphic designer Edward McKnight Kauffer, are among the most technically successful of his portraits. Note how in the self-portrait, McIntyre has easily, though with great deliberation, filled in the area of his face using an intense green for the lines and the shadows, and then blocked in the rest of the picture with these broad and varied strokes, leaving the whole in a kind of calculated state of unfinish. This portrait is also remarkable within his work in that it describes a context, a background, none other than some wall, a gallery, or perhaps his studio, in which we can see his own pictures hanging together in their broad white frames. Of the few known portraits of men by McIntyre, the portrait of Edward McKnight Kauffer is the most immediate. Like the 1908 depiction of his niece, Contempt, that I showed you earlier, this is an informal portrayal of a close friend, executed rapidly and at close range. Kauffer was an American artist and a graphic designer who lived for much of his life in the United Kingdom. He was born Edward Leyland Kauffer in Great Falls in Montana, and he moved to San Francisco working as a bookseller, studying art at the California School of Design from 1910 to 1912. At around this time, Professor Joseph McKnight of the University of Utah became aware of Kauffer's work and sponsored him, sending him to Paris to further study. And in gratitude, Kauffer took the sponsor's name as his middle name. And Kauffer moved to London at the start of the First World War, remaining there for most of his career. He's best known for the 140 posters that he produced for the London Underground, then London Transport. I've just got one example there for you, and the beautiful movie poster above. His posters spanned many styles and show lots of influence from abstraction, including Futurism, Cubism, Vorticism, and even the Impressionist influences of Japanese woodcuts. So these two panels then were executed slightly later than the self-portrait and the portrait of Edward McKnight Kauffer that I've just talked about. On the left is Arnold Henry Mason, a successful artist just along the wall there from Edward, a successful artist and a close friend from McIntyre's earliest years in London's. And on the right here is a portrait of an unnamed woman titled Woman in a Black Hat. Both of these paintings make use of thin underglazes, paint layers which are allowed to show through the subsequent glazes. If you look closely at the work on the right, you'll see that the black-hatted woman has a bright salmon pink underlayer, allowed in parts to shine through with its full brilliance. The modelling of her face and her neck, however, achieved by partial modification with just very thin, translucent paint layers. Woman in a Red Jacket, this is a favourite work of mine on the left from the University of Canterbury, and on the right, and work from the Hocken that I know very well on the left. Woman in a Red Jacket is moving McIntyre's style further in the direction of three-dimensional solidity gained through the modelling of volume. McIntyre is not so much retreating into pictorial conservatism, but instead looking to the general European movement away from that hectic experimentation of Cubism that characterised the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Even Picasso was classicising at this time, as you'll see in his portrait here of his poor beleaguered wife, Olga. With this new style that he had developed, McIntyre finally achieved official favour. It was his portrait of the Icelandic poet Haraldur Heimar that was accepted for the 1924 exhibition at the Royal Academy. Despite his continual assertion that he thought nothing of acceptance of the Royal Academy and he didn't care for recognition by those stodgers, it was worthless to him, it is interesting that McIntyre really did continue to crave acceptance of his work and continuously submitted paintings for exhibition. Unfortunately, the winning factor here that got him in the door was probably Haymar's reputation as a poet, rather than McIntyre's virtuosity. Nevertheless, this is probably one of his most exceptional portraits. It's one in which the poet's sardonic gaze directly confronts you. As in the portrait of Eve Balfour, the Christchurch-born actress I showed you earlier, and that of Edward McKnight seen here on the wall, we feel like we're making some contact with the actual personality. This portrait here of Doris Mulgan on the left, and there's another on the wall at the back there, is the only example I could find to show you his late interest in a kind of modified pointillism, in which he distributes little flecks of colour across the surfaces. Here we're aware of these very physical qualities to his brushwork, short, dabby strokes nervously applied. Look at the shadow on the wall behind Doris, whereas in the Heralder Haymar, the shadow was fairly uniform in colour and dark. In Doris Mulgan, the shadow is alive with points of colour. Doris Mulgan was McIntyre's youngest sister, and this is probably a private picture, not made for exhibition. Here you have the portrait, of course, of her son, Dennis, in the exhibition from the collection of Avon McKinnon. In later life, McIntyre was very reluctant to exhibit his work and turned to doing portraits of many of his relatives and friends. Instead, he spent his time pouring his public persona into lively art reviews, which he contributed between 1923 and 31 to the Architectural Review, one of London's leading periodicals. Did he expect to stay away from New Zealand forever when he left Christchurch in 1909? In 1925, while he was reviewing an exhibition of Australian painters, McIntyre wrote, "So, the most enterprising are forced to leave their own country, and some of them have stayed away for quite a long time and have, from any artistic meaning of the word, ceased to be Australians." Change the nationality, and it's a fairly accurate account of McIntyre's own situation. Can we really call him a New Zealand painter? He knew that his ambitions were impossible to fulfill in this country, and he preferred exile to what he called suffocation. What he could not know was that the perennial brain drain has its other face. There has been a return to New Zealand, a repatriation, if you like, of most of the important work executed abroad. As is the case with his contemporary Francis Hodgkins, McIntyre's paintings have been avidly collected in New Zealand, so that it now has been possible for the New Zealand Portrait Gallery to mount this exhibition, drawn mostly from Wellington and Hawke's Bay collections. And I just thought you might be interested to see that the Fletcher Art Trust, under Peter Shaw as curator, purchased this portrait, self-portrait, in 2014 for $103,000. It made the front page of the Herald when it was a record price, and then sold it comparatively recently, and it fetched slightly less, $88,000. So the fortunes of Raymond McIntyre's work may be given a bit of a boost by this New Zealand Portrait Gallery show. Well, I've enjoyed sharing some of my enthusiasm for McIntyre's work over the past 45 minutes, and I hope each of you can spend some time with the actual paintings themselves and find equal enjoyment in discovering McIntyre for yourselves. And just as a little postscript, I thought I would show you this lovely portrait of Phyllis Cavendish, which fetched only $47,000 in 2014. So the portrait of him, which I don't think is as good a painting, in fact, received more. But McIntyre lives on in social media, and in fact, this exhibition, I think, has created a kind of a meme where people are recreating the forms of Phyllis Constance Cavendish with her characteristic Princess Leia hairstyle, and standing and posing in the mode. So Thank you very much for your attention. I'd welcome any of your questions.